Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Marty Coleman, and on behalf of Sustainable World and all the Peace and Justice Ministries here, I want to welcome you this evening. And I want every Sustainable World member to please stand up. Just stand up, stand up, stand up. That's good. These are really good folks. Thank you, team. I also owe a great debt of thanks to Francisco Garcia, who is our new Peace and Justice Director, and he knocked himself out to help me to make this happen. So we have a lot of wonderful people that pitched in at the last minute here. This is a really remarkable evening. The doctors, Fran and David Korten, have been our guides and our mentors for over 10 years. And it all started when a group of us, veteran activists, read this, When Corporations Rule the World. And it set our hearts on fire, and the rest is history. I called David and said, you don't know who I am, but you've started a small revolution here in the Southland. And that has begun a beautiful friendship. These people are not only wise and brilliant and charismatic, but they're friends. So this is an extraordinary time for us to be together and to have 2 hours with Dr. Korten. Now, you would think, after reading the number of books that he's written, that he is an economist. His book, The Agenda for a New Economy, From Phantom Wealth to Real Wealth, The Great Turning, From Empire to Earth Community, The Post-Corporate World, Life After Capitalism, and the international bestseller, When Corporations Rule the World. I could go on and on about the other things that he's done, but it's important for us to know that his PhD from Stanford is in integrative studies. It is in the business school. Thank you for reminding me, David. And it is not economics. It's about how structures influence human behavior. I got that right? Now this helps us to understand out of what energy came this great idea of the integrative cosmology. This is wonderful, good, healthy stuff, and you'll find roots in Thomas Berry, Teilhard de Chardin, other wonderful thinkers who are trying to ask the questions, what is the human family for? And what is our place in the universe? And then, of course, here's all this good thinking, and then there's Fran Korten, who puts it all into very practical use, Fran, in Yes Magazine. So I want you to put your hands together. We're going to ask Dr. Korten, both of them, Doctors Kortens, to stand up together, and we'll welcome them here. Thank you so much, dear people, for being with us. Here they are, our friends and our mentors. I could tell you stories for the next 3 hours about these wonderful people, but we only have 2 hours to carry on this conversation. So, David, please come forward. We're all ears. This is meant to be not a presentation, not a long speech, but
a love fest.
but an interactive conversation. There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it is so thrilling to be back here at this amazing All Saints Church. Is recalling that it seems like each time my thinking goes to a new level, I end up here for the launch of the next phase of my work. And of course, When Corporations Rule the World, and then we actually launched The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community here, and I gather some of you were part of that. So it really feels like being at home. And how many of you have read the essay, the Religion, Science? Okay, about half, I guess. So I was hoping you had all read it, and then we could just sit down and have a conversation. But we'll weave this through. I've had one other such conversation like this, which was in D.C., organized by the Contemplative Alliance, and it was kind of back and forth. I'm still in the process of learning how to do this, so we will be creating the evening together. It's not like that essay or anything else I or anyone else has written as the final answer, but the key here is to open up a new conversation, a new exploration that is not constrained by our old stories, and growing out of the recognition that our future depends fundamentally on a new story that acknowledges the deeper realities of creation, and stories that put us on a path to a positive future. So we'll go through some of the thinking, some of my thinking on that, and I want not just your questions, but also I want the benefit of your own thinking. And I've been working with a number of groups around the country now that are very excited about the idea of a conversation. In fact, the conversation is already underway. I mean, interfaith groups that are realizing it's more than tolerance. It is about recognizing at the deepest level we're talking about the same thing. And other groups that refer to themselves as interspirit, who come at this from a cosmic spirituality oneness frame. But we'll also talk about where I think our framing needs to go to a deeper level than that. And those of you who've read the paper, my own sense is that if there is any distinctive contribution in that paper, rather than a kind of a synthesis of ideas that a lot of people are into, it is this idea of the functionality of differentiated consciousness. If we start from a sense that it's a unitary consciousness, then you've got to ask, well, why this veil of illusion and the separation? And, I talk about that a bit in the paper, and I think it really relates to this idea of the creative possibilities of distributed intelligence. That the unitary intelligence has recognized this power. At a very simplistic level, it's like we find now that a whole lot of interconnected desktop computers is actually more powerful than one mega computer or supercomputer. And this is what I'm thinking makes sense as a way of understanding how the cosmos organizes. But we'll get further into that. I was, Marty, as you were doing the introduction and holding up when corporations rule the world and how this really set us on fire, I was recalling back that when I first launched that book, so many people came to me and said, wow, I loved your book. It gave me such a sense of hope. And I said, really? I said, I got really depressed writing it. And the response I got back is, oh, yeah, I got that. I got that. I did read it. But what gave me the sense of hope is now I have a better understanding of why things are going so bad. It's actually very much like what I thought was going on. But now I have more of a framework and a language to talk about it. And if I have any contribution, it is helping people see connections that they sort of know are there, but they don't quite see them, partly because they are contrary to the ongoing conversation. So many of us don't have the courage to sort of step forward and say, that doesn't make any sense. Marty says, I want you all to be very clear, I'm not an economist. Is there anybody here that is a professional economist? Interesting. Okay, well, I can be very candid with you then. One of the things I've noticed is that economists have absolutely no understanding of institutions or power. And most strange of all, they don't really understand money. It's all about prices. And so actually when somebody calls me an economist, I say, no, that's an insult. Anyhow, I should not dwell on that. Okay. Now, another piece of this is in the political debates. One of the things that that I've noticed, is that generally people on the far right focus on capturing, defining our framing stories, and work very much from emotion, a gut reaction. And by framing the stories, they basically frame the conversation and the agenda. More progressive groups tend to have lists of agenda items, and we negotiate on our agenda items based on research and fact and information and all of that. But we always end up leaving the larger frame of the conversation to the right wing. And I think part of what's exciting is I'm seeing evidence all around of people coming forward that the timing is exactly right for this conversation. To me, it's almost like within the last 9 months. Extraordinary. Because the basic ideas in that cosmology, that Sacred Story paper, are in The Great Turning. But nobody's ever really picked up on those as a basis for a conversation. Now people all around that I talk to are picking up, and it's partly because of an awareness of how badly our current system is going wrong, how urgent the need is for a new story and a new frame. So it's an extraordinarily exciting time. And here's kind of the crux of this. What if Earth were sacred and we valued society as a living community rather than a financial burden? You know, education, healthcare are so expensive, we really can't afford them. Anything that has to do with even our physical infrastructure is crumbling. It's just too expensive to maintain a society. Now, truth is, Earth is sacred. And in fact, I'm realizing most people recognize that Earth is sacred, but only in their own heart. It's a private conversation. And I was actually concerned for a while. I was thinking this is a great frame, but if we come out with that publicly, we're going to be condemned as pagans. And I'm beginning to get a sense that maybe not. But particularly if the idea comes forward from faith and spirit groups and not just from us more secular types. In a sense, I think of myself as secular because I do not identify with any particular religion. I'm unaffiliated. I have a deep sense of spirituality, but I'm not identified as such. People think of me as an economist. But if it begins to come from folks who are deeply affiliated with faith and religious organizations, then it becomes very hard to say, well, that's just paganism. No, this is a foundation of our faith. So I'm hoping that we can get into some questions. What's the deeper nature of the problem we face? What essential shifts in thinking are necessary to put ourselves as a species on a different path? How can we foster this shift? And what is the role of spiritual communities and practitioners in assisting the emergence of a new vision of human possibility? So does that sound like an interesting conversation for tonight? Now, one of the interesting conversations I'm involved in, are you all familiar with the nation of Bhutan and their gross national happiness indicators? Well, the Bhutan government has gotten the United Nations interested in this, and the United Nations passed a resolution declaring happiness as a human goal, and asked Bhutan to form a working group to do a report to the United Nations to advance the conversation. I have the privilege of being a member of that working group. Now, it's really interesting that the Prime Minister of Bhutan issued a charge to the working group that said, this is about a new paradigm. It means a fundamental new worldview. It is not about adjustments at the margins of the old system. Now, at one level, that did not come as anything new or strange to me, but the more I thought about it within that frame, that this is really a new paradigm, it is a fundamental shift in our human perception, I realized that it was a challenge even to those of us who have, sort of fancied ourselves as being on the leading edge of thinking about change, but it really helped sharpen the focus. And it's now got me thinking about, okay, now how do we think about what policy initiatives are really adjustments, but within the established worldview or frame, and which are the ones that actually move us in the direction of a fundamentally new understanding and a fundamentally new institutional system. So that's been a lot of fun, and that's part of what has been pushing me on this issue of what are our deepest framing stories. Now, what's the problem? This is a problem from a system perspective. If you think about human society, you think about the global economy as a self-organizing system, a set of institutions grounded in a culture that moves our choices as a society in a particular direction. And as you begin to deconstruct that, actually using the tools that I learned at the Stanford Business School in terms of understanding institutional systems, it becomes very clear that we what I sometimes call the old suicide economy. Its primary value is money and making money, and we can talk more about that. It's really strange because if you really understand money, it's nothing but numbers and a counter on a computer hard drive. And yet we organize our whole society around it, and as we make those numbers grow on that computer, we say, wow, we're getting rich. Can you understand that? That's kind of stupid? Now, this is one of the things economists don't get, so congratulations. Well, this system, if you understand how it organizes, it actually is built right into the belief systems and the incentive systems of our dominant institutions, that in the pursuit of money, they self-organize toward environmental collapse, toward a massive concentration of wealth and power, and toward political corruption. I mean, if you got this much power, financial and economic power, you're kind of foolish not to use it to assume political power, and so we find our democracy bought out. So this is the deeper challenge, is we need a whole new system, a new living economy, a living society that values life, that life is the defining value, which is why I think this frame of sacred earth may be the kind of fulcrum point. But create within the systems a self-reinforcing dynamic that moves us all in the direction of earth balance. In other words, finding a way that we live in balance with Earth's biosphere, with Earth's natural systems, that leads toward shared prosperity, a sharing of the real wealth such that every person is able to meet their needs. And this is not free handouts. We've all got to work. But we should all get adequate compensation for our work in terms of those things that are most essential to our living. And third is all done within a framework of living democracy, which is not just about going to the polls every 2 years or so, but really is about a living engagement on a day-by-day basis. So is all this fairly clear so far? Any questions, particularly questions of understanding? Yes, sir.
dichotomies. Oh, I'm sorry. Just polar discussion of issues, and many times, depending on what institutions that exist now, I think sometimes I see both things in one institution. So I guess you're not saying that either or. It's just that we want to get closer to the things on the right.
Well, it'd be interesting to have a longer conversation about, do you have a particular institution in mind?
Yes. I was thinking of, well, one that I serve a lot is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So there are a lot of things about it that are all about, expanding human knowledge and such, but there are other things about it that aren't just that, so.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, very interesting example. It actually reminds me, if you go to Vimeo, the video site on the web, and look for Overview. Are you familiar with the Overview video? It's very new. It's an extraordinary 20-minute documentary based on mainly footage from NASA, from space, with commentary by the astronauts on the impact on their worldview, psyche, and spirituality of looking back at Earth from space. And I don't think they ever use the term sacred Earth in it, but you can just hear that is what is behind them. Yeah, actually, I think of an institution like NASA, and it's a very interesting example, not as one of the institutions that is locked into one direction or another. I mean, as you may know from When Corporations Rule the World, the real crux of that is from the global financial markets and their power, and then the publicly traded corporations that are captive of that, and then the Supreme Court and our political institutions that are so attuned to money by the nature of the rules. And much of it has to do with, of the change has to do with redoing the structures of power. And NASA, of course, is not a power institution, although it has a lot of money.
Yeah, I just wanted to really hold up that Overview video. It's really worth watching. And it really spoke to the whole changed perspective for these astronauts at seeing the Earth separate from the Earth and how transformational, it was for them. So it's really worth the 12 or 13 minutes to watch it.
It might be something for you to watch as a group and have a discussion about.
It's really powerful.
Yeah. As I was looking at it, I thought, I think this is the most powerful video I've ever seen. Yeah.
Hi. Under the current system, our society seems to have a shared goal of retiring at the age of 50 or 65. And I'm wondering, under a shared prosperity, would you promote working until death? Or at what age should people not work anymore and still share?
I love that question. Some of you may have heard my personal story. And it's an amazing commentary on our culture and our lack of ceremony, of what's the ceremony, but the particular rituals of marking passage, rites of passage, or lack of rites of passage. Now, when I was coming up on age 65, I'm 75 now, so we'll put the story in context. When I was coming up on age 65, I thought, wow, what does this mean? I guess I've just got to face up to the fact that the end is coming, and I should be focusing my attention on rotating off the boards I'm in, passing on the leadership to younger people. Probably face up, I'm not going to be writing any more books. Make sure the will is in order and so forth. Just the responsible things that one should do as you're nearing death. And so as I was mulling on this, Fran one morning said, I'm going to organize a 65th birthday party for you. I said, you are? What's to celebrate? This is sort of the beginning of signing out. No, I said we're going to have a birthday party. We're going to celebrate. Well, okay, if it makes you happy. So we had the party out on our back porch, and one of our Native American friends who is into Native American ceremony, Tim Istapakanawakiwa, a wonderful individual. It turned out that there was a surprise in this party, and the surprise was that he initiated me into elderhood. It was probably no more than a 5-minute ceremony. But it was probably also the most important experience of my life. Because in that instant, he communicated to me that I was passing into the most important and most beautiful time of life, the time of serving the tribe as a wisdom keeper, as a teacher, as a mentor. And I came out of that and said, wow. And so since, I've started new organizations, written more books, The Great Turning and the Agenda for a New Economy, and now working on this little cosmology creation story issue. And is it ever fun? Fran and I just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary, and and as we reflected back, we realized the most recent 10 years has been the best 10 years of our life, which of course coincides with that 10 years after 65, and we're looking forward to the next 10 years being even better. So that's my view of this retirement. Yeah, what is this retirement thing anyway? I think this is part of our understanding. I mean, partly we have created an economy in which the work most people are forced to do under the conditions is totally demeaning, dehumanizing. It is a pain to go to work in the morning. And I do believe we can organize society so that most all of us are going to work partly, doing things we would want to do even if we weren't paid. But of course, money's part of maintaining our needs. So that's a part of it, but a totally different thing that we're not doing it because we're, in a sense, forced into conditions of nearly virtual slavery in order to keep body and soul together. So if we can make that transformation, then the whole idea of retirement, I mean, we do have to recognize that some jobs we can't do as we get older just because of the physical demands, but that we should all, up until our very last breath, to the extent that we are physically and mentally capable of doing so, be making some contribution to the tribe, to the community. And it's a hell of a lot more interesting than just sitting back watching television or playing golf, or, it's fun to sip Mai Tais on the beach for a week, maybe 2 weeks, but after that it gets pretty boring. Besides, you get sunburned. So, anyhow, this is the state of the challenge, and we're not going to get to this system by tweaks at the margin of this system, and that's the key lesson here. Now, what did I do with my clicker? Here we go. So I'm sure you all know Thomas Berry. Back when I was writing the epilogue to When Corporations Rule the World, I was talking to people about, giving various talks about how, as a species, we're on a path to self-destruction unless we navigate some really deep changes. And I was quite stunned by the common response. Well, yeah, you know, I think you're probably right. It does look like we're headed for self-destruction. But wouldn't it be really inconvenient and expensive to change? And, you know, if we did, then we'd be ending the party. And, you know, the pessimists may be wrong. Maybe it's not really a problem anyway. So, you know, let's party till the lights go out. Oh. So I thought it was kind of a strange reaction and certainly a little depressing. And as I was mulling on it, I read Thomas Berry's Dream of the Earth. And, you know, this is one of his key phrases. For people generally, their story of the universe and the human role in the universe is their primary source of intelligibility and value. The deepest crises experienced by any society are those moments of change when the story becomes inadequate for meeting the survival demands of a present situation. And, of course, what he was talking about were our creation stories, and that sort of set me on the path of, oh, our predominant creation stories really give us no reason to live. And that's kind of a big deal. Kind of a big deal, particularly the idea of the continuity of the species, the continuity of life on Earth, the continuity of the cosmos, and suggests a deep lack of any sense that our existence here is of some deeper purpose or meaning. So, this then begins to get us into these larger issues, and I just want to share this. Any of you who read the paper saw a little text box at the end with this basic framework, and I'm seeing that a lot of people have elements of the really big story. But where it becomes really powerful is when we connect the three narratives. The integral spirit cosmology, which we'll talk a little bit more about and its implications, which is the most abstract, the kind of deepest level of meaning. But then the intermediate frame of sacred living Earth, of Earth as a living organism, as Earth as our sacred mother, the source of life. And as we begin to understand how Earth organizes, how the biosphere, the living systems of Earth organize, we begin to see certain organizing principles and a framework for thinking about how we might organize as a human society to create living Earth economies that actually work with nature in a dynamic, mutually synergistic relationship with Earth's natural systems, with the soils, with the water, the weather, etc. And of course, part of understanding what is so deeply dysfunctional of our existing system is that we are literally, well, one of the extraordinary things about the evolution of life on Earth is that the earlier life forms that we consider to be lower forms of life actually self-organized in a way that sequestered extra carbon and toxics from the atmosphere and from the surface and buried them deep in Earth to create the conditions that allowed what we consider higher life forms to emerge, including ourselves. So now we consider ourselves to be the highest form of life. And what are we doing? We're taking all those toxics and carbons out of the Earth and throwing them back up in the atmosphere so that we can utilize technologies that are designed to work in direct opposition to the Earth. And it's clearest, I think, in agriculture, where with our pesticides, with our chemical fertilizers and so forth, we're trying to overpower all the natural dynamics of nature in a way that destroys the natural fertility and vitality of the soils, is dangerous to our own health, et cetera, and doing it with, of course, incredible expenditures of fossil energy, which are changing the climate and have the potential to set evolution back several billion years, not to mention getting rid of the human species that caused the problem. Earth is very adaptive. But we consider ourselves the highest form of intelligence that we have so far encountered in the cosmos. Now, is this intelligent behavior? But again, this is part of the very deep shift in consciousness to begin to think of Earth as sacred. A sacred creation that created the conditions that made our emergence and existence possible. Wow. Okay, so it's interesting that one of my colleagues pointed out that this sequence goes from the immanent at the bottom, the living Earth, to the transcendent with the integral cosmology, and in the other direction from the abstract to the practical pathway. So that when we get down to the frameworks of a living economy, we're actually talking about very practical things. So those of you who've read the essay will see this instantly. The rest of you will also get it instantly. Let me just remind myself what's next. Yeah, okay. I'm suggesting that at the reduced to the most simplistic terms, we have basically three cosmological choices. The one that tends to be most familiar out within the society, the public, is the distant patriarch, as captured in this image, God in the image of man. Now, it's very interesting if you think about that. It means my primary relationship is to the patriarch out there. And the conventional belief is that patriarch, that God, is all-knowing and all-powerful. Which means that everything that happens is by his will. So if it's by his will, it's not my will, and therefore it's not my responsibility. And it also is, my primary relationships, not to my wife or to my neighbors or to the earth, it is to him. So I'm looking up there. Now, we think about this in different ways, and I relate this to religion because obviously it is integral to religion. This is not to say that all religious people believe this, but it is the frame most associated with particularly our Abrahamic religions. Now, I was once struck listening on the radio to a call-in show. There's a woman called in. It was a discussion of these the distant patriarch of religion, and she says, I think of my stay over here on earth as nothing more than a stay over at a cheap hotel on my way to heaven. So you're not kind of thinking about how you're going to contribute to the upkeep of this cheap hotel. I mean, this kind of captures it. Of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with the rapturist frame that actually, as we destroy the earth and there are more crises, more breakdowns, wow, celebration. This is terrific because it means the end is near, the rapture is near, and we the believers will be lifted up to heaven to be at the hand of God. So our stories do have deep implications. Now, the second major story is the story of science, the conventional story of Newtonian science, that the cosmos is essentially could be characterized as a giant clockworks with a spring that's winding down toward heat death. That only the material is real, or those things that are observable in a material sense. that life is nothing more than an accidental outcome of material complexity, and consciousness and free will are illusions. Wow, that's quite a story. How's that make you feel? You know, if you think about it, it's a story that totally strips life of any meaning, any direction. It means we are alone, terrifyingly alone, in a cosmos that cares nothing whatever for our existence. Why? I think I better go shopping. And that's not just facetious. Because, of course, the shopping, the material gratification, the pursuit of hedonistic pleasures is all part of distracting ourselves from this terrible loneliness, the meaninglessness of existence. And, of course, that way that theory plays out as well in the biology sphere, in the theory of evolution, is that evolution is about chance mutations, about survival of the fittest, and the perishing of the unfit or the least fit. But there is, again, no purpose behind it, no meaning, and no responsibility. But it translates directly into our framing economic theories about the relentless pursuit of competitive pursuit of profit, the financial gain, which is really the relentless pursuit of my power relative to your power. And if I can destroy your firm, I'm the winner. And if you're left with no means of livelihood, well, that's just the way nature works. And I'm the winner. Again, the power of a story. I mean, the extent to which that story frames and legitimates our existing economic system is quite extraordinary. Now, these are the two stories. Well, the other thing I forgot to mention in terms of the distant patriarch, if everything is by his will, then, I mean, this goes back to an explicit Calvinist belief. We don't hear it explicitly anymore, but it's certainly implicit. If everything's by his will, then those who are most powerful and have the greatest wealth in terms of money and financial power are clearly those who are closest to God and God's most favored. So it's not to me to question that. So these two frames create the foundation of much of our institutional system, which is responsible for leading us to ever deeper devastation. So then we turn to the integral spirit frame. By this reckoning, all of creation, all of the cosmos, all of the reality that we see is a manifestation of a sacred spiritual intelligence manifesting on a journey of discovery to know its possibilities, to know itself and its possibilities. Everything that exists is a manifestation of that, from humans to the smallest microbes. From the stars to the grain of sand. And if we think of it all as a creative process that involves a differentiation of that consciousness, intentionally, not as a mistake, not as something for us to escape from, but rather to engage, we begin to understand that there is a deep purpose in our existence here. That every being is here to play some role in this great cosmic unfolding, this journey of discovery. And we bring to that process the distinctive qualities of our reflective consciousness, among other things. Now, if we can begin to, well, and here's another piece of it. This is where I get such a sense of hope. Distant Patriarch is supported by a great many very powerful institutions of religion. The Grand Machine story is supported by the institutions of science generally, and in fact most of our academic institutions. The Integral Spirit story, at least so far as I can identify, I mean there are groups that that practice and teach this, but it's hard to find any particular recognized group of any particular influence or stature that is dedicated to advancing the story. And if you're paying attention in the media, you very rarely hear anything that reflects that framework in the media. Now, on the other side, virtually every, well, I shouldn't say. I do occasionally run into some people with a decidedly different view. But most everyone that I have engaged in conversation with in any kind of relationship, the Integral Spirit is basically their story. And, I want to do a little conversation about this in a couple of minutes. But my assumption is that it's probably the story of most everybody in this room. But since we don't hear it in the public conversation, it remains our private story and has virtually no influence in the public square. And it has far less influence in our own lives than it might have because we're working within a culture that denies it, and we are all trying to survive within institutions that actively deny it and that reward us for behaving in ways that are consistent with these other stories. Now, the exciting part about this is, if you believe that this story is foundational to our future, and the key to our future, we don't have to go out proselytizing to convince anybody. All we have to do is create a space for the conversation. So I'd like to hear your thoughts and reflections on what's your story? How do you think about it? What do you hear from your friends? What do you think their story is? This is actually just a summary of these points I've been making. Which story fits your understanding? Your friends? Which does your church teach and affirm? I mentioned to Marty, I live on Bainbridge Island up in Puget Sound, and we have an amazing Episcopal church on our island, and I've occasionally gone to services there, and I'm really struck that the sermon, the conversations, wow, I mean, they are so clearly coming from an integral spirit frame. You hear the liturgy? Oh, my God! Totally distant patriarch. I don't know what your experience is here, but I'd be interested in your reflections on, and maybe some of you come from other churches, and do you ever have any explicit conversation about this, that these are fundamentally conflicting ideas? Sir. We'll get to the mic here.
Well, I think the way I experience it as of late is, of course, I grew up in this old frame, and that's the frame I pretty much used to dealing with. And
The distant patriarch.
The patriarchy or the science.
Yeah.
I was a science teacher formerly.
Oh, right, yeah, you're the science guy, yeah.
So,
and of course, I just want to mention, as we move this conversation forward, to me, one of the most important conversations is between the faith community and the scientists in the search for common ground, because as I note in the paper, there is a potential synthesis here that can work beautifully and deepens our understanding of the integral spirit.
So, I started to recognize things were not right about the end of the century, and have been reading and studying and and then got active because I knew enough. I didn't need to keep reading. So the way I'm experiencing it now is that I'm working with other people in the community here, and we're creating a lot of what I'll call new paradigm activities and alternatives. And so I'm sort of dancing back and forth between, I would say, an integral spirit and the old institutions or frames. So that's how I'm experiencing it right now, and it's a lot of fun. But I find myself, slipping back.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to undo those. I'm 50 plus, so
Well,
it's hard to undo that upbringing.
Even though these all seem very familiar, my hope is that just laying them out in very simple, clear-cut, unambiguous, no nuance ways help us to have that conversation so we can see more clearly the distinctions in the
I want to ask you, since I'm up, one of the things I'm working on is, I won't even tell you. I'll just ask, are you familiar with Charles Eisenstein and his book, Sacred Economics? Have you read it?
I haven't read the whole thing.
I'm studying it at this point because I think there's a lot of overlap in what you're doing. And I
think there is. There's certainly a lot of overlap between a lot of what I write about and Charles, and I got great respect for him. But I did get turned off by the way he treats money in the book, because I think he's buying into an old, very partial frame that doesn't get us very
All right, I'll have to ask you about that,
That's
but I'm going to let the conversation go on for now. Thanks.
Oh. I'll let you watch for the hands and decide.
My name is Ignacio Castuera, and I'm a United Methodist, and I have for about 50 years now been under the influence of process theology.
Oh yes, yeah.
And what I hear you talking about in the integral part is what I have lived out of. I have lived out of that paradigm, and continue to share it with others as precisely the kind of thing that can pull us out of this impasse. And earlier, Marty, I think, mentioned Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin would be one of those. Henri Bergson, the whole philosophy of organism, and then Alfred North Whitehead, all of those are the giants that inform me. They all are a synthesis, a very creative synthesis of high respect for modern science. Actually, we should really be saying postmodern, definitely quantum physics in the case of Whitehead, and philosophy or cosmology. So when you're talking about cosmology, I mean, but also the other thing that's feeding me now quite a bit is the earlier cosmologies, the native peoples' cosmologies, who always consider Pachamama and Gaia sacred. And I think that there's a need to really integrate the divinity, which is not the patriarch that you're correct in pointing out as one of the models, but it's the divinity in every part of the universe. And I like to commend to everyone a wonderful poet, a Nicaraguan poet by the name of Ernesto Cardenal, and his Cántico Cósmico, the Cosmic Canticle, over 500 pages poem, in which he creatively integrates science, pays great tribute to David Bohm, the physicist, the late physicist, and also at the same time lifting up the native cosmologies of people. And so it seems to me that that's where we need to go. And in terms of specifically economics, and I deeply respect the work that you've done, and I'm here precisely because I admire what you have done, but also the parallels with what Cobb and Daly did in For the Common Good and other types of economic proposals. And so I'd like for people at least to know that definitely you're not going to see this in the news, but that there are those kinds of efforts, such as the Center for Process Studies, which, by the way, just for you all to know, there are 21 centers for process studies in mainland China today.
But there what?
21 centers for process studies in mainland China. And we both are trying to expand them into Latin America. On November 17th, they opened the first Center for Process Studies in Kinshasa in the Congo, because Congolese priests trained at Louvain understood that the vision of Whitehead validates, so to speak. Now, they're not interested necessarily in validation, but they're very happy that it does validate the native cosmologies of the Africans. So to me, that is a very promising kind of a thing, which is congruent with everything I hear you say. I mean, you have not actually spelled out. You put question marks at the end of the integrative kind of a thing, but it seems to me that that kind of dialogue needs to be strengthened. And by the way, in your own state, I get encouraged by what Eric Liu and Nick Hanauer did in Gardens of Democracy, and the comparison of the garden brain versus the mechanical brain. I mean, and I hope that that more people would go in the direction of the garden brain.
Yeah. No, very insightful comments. Now, the institutions that you mentioned in China and Africa, I had no knowledge of, and that's process theology.
Yeah,
I know.
well, the Center for Process Studies in Claremont has created these other centers for process studies in China, and independent in some ways from that, because of the Whitehead International network, then the Center for Process Studies in Louvain produced then the Center for Process Studies in the Congo. So these are just proliferating quite a bit now. Yeah. Well, and I'm willing I'm willing also to stay after that, because I don't want to just monopolize this. But at least I want to make sure that, especially since it's in Southern California, that more of you just kind of get curious at least about what Cobb has been doing. He's going to be 88 next week and very much alive. We're planning the 10th International Whitehead Conference would be held at Claremont, California on 2015. And we have a massive vision of what can be done during that time. I hope you can be there, by the way.
And of course, your mention of Daly and Cobb, most of the economics that I trust and teach is from Daly and Cobb. I haven't seen John Cobb Jr. for a while, but have great respect for him. Now, my question back to you is, there are all of these deep traditions, and you're even talking about networks of institutions that I had no knowledge of, and the whole process theology thing, which of course is exactly what I'm talking about, but we never hear about it in public conversation. Now, do you have any sense of why? I mean, one of my thoughts is that partly because it's called process theology. I mean, doesn't exactly capture the imagination, but I think, why hasn't then been getting any traction beyond these private discussions, and is there a chance to bring that out of the box, and there are things that can be done to bring it out of the box?
Thank you for the opportunity to share that. I really think that a lot of people were turned off. I think in general people are not geared to think philosophically. And so whenever they hear something, I don't want to be thinking about all of that. My feeling is that if they just gave a concentrated time to think about, just for instance, the analogy of the airplane that Whitehead has, that what we have to do is all of these cosmological visions have to be landed constantly on very specific things. I mean, Cobb abandoned the so-called, quote, philosophical kind of thing when he started working on the environment. He was the very first theologian to respond to the ecological crisis. In 1970, writing Is It Too Late?, which it was already in 1970. He was not writing just about cosmology or anything like that. But process thinking, I mean, to call it process theology, you're right, it doesn't have any cachet. But it inspired Chinese in 21 major universities to create centers for process studies. Postmodern philosophy is the other term that has also been getting traction in in China, and the Institute for the Postmodern Development of China, which is also based in Claremont, is connected with the Center for Process Studies. And here are these, quote, communists, who are saying, why should we go the modern route when the people who have been living in the midst of modernity are saying, the heck with modernity, let's go to postmodernity. And postmodernity and process have been associated for quite a while. David Griffin's book, The Reenchantment of Science, is the one that captured the imagination of the Chinese, and that's part of the reason there are 21 centers. My hope is that now that there are 21 centers in China, people would go, where did we miss it? Maybe we need to start thinking a little bit more, And Kinshasa, I mean, why is it that people in the Congo get it, and we just go, oh, carbon daily, they're not really part of it. And the other thing is, I think that it's a vision that is so radically opposed to the way things are that, the New York Times, the LA Times, all of those people, they're not going to give us any time for that.
We're trying to break through that, but my suggestion would be work on rebranding. Not changing the concept, but just find a new name that is a little more gripping. Anyway, ma'am, sorry to keep you waiting so long, but this is
it's
so on
interesting.
target.
Amazing. I think that one of the things that is very striking to me, I see most of my adult life has been sort of at an intersection between Christian and Buddhist and Quaker and that sort of thing. And one of the things that is very striking to me is how much change is in fact happening quite mysteriously and organically. In other words, it really doesn't, in some ways, I wonder whether it really matters that, for you it's happening at this intellectual level, and it's a language that means something to you and resonates to you, and that works, and it'll start connecting, and setting out its little tendrils in all the different directions of people for whom that's the language. For other people, it's known in world music, and it's experienced in world music in a very bodily way, and it's making its way across all these lines that way. When I talk to my students, I teach in a girls' school, and I say, well, what if we were to look, and I teach history, what if we were looking at the model of history not in terms of cause and effect, but instead of something like the ecology of history? History is an ecology. And that they have no trouble whatsoever going, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not, this and that. It's the conditions of all of these things. I said, well, what if you and I are those conditions? How much can we? They have no trouble with that. I mean, this is world music for some people. This is Buddhism for millions of people. This is, 2 nights ago, a lot of us were here listening to John Philip Newell, and for him it's Celtic Christianity, and it's known, and he's saying, gosh, it's everywhere. And it just seems to me that, I think it's true that our beginning to tell our stories out in the open might encourage each other. But I also think that I have more faith than I used to that there's a kind of earth wisdom in subterfuge. It's what the underground. I think of in Zen, it's called the hazy moon of enlightenment. That when you come straight up and say, okay, I'm going to, launch a frontal attack on the fundamentalist point of view by, coming out and creating a platform. Well, as soon as you do that, then you're entering into that either-or fundamentalist kind of thing. But if you just don't buy in and do these things and start talking to each other in other ways, in fact, it's happening. It's like this white corpuscle, movement through the system. And in a certain way, I have more faith in it than I did 30 years ago.
I love what's coming out here of the strands of this thinking, this feeling, this deep sense that once one looks, you can find it in many, many places, but we somehow don't recognize the whole. And perhaps even the people involved in the individual strands don't recognize their connection with the overall weave, which in a sense come back again to why we need the more open public conversation so people can discover these connections. I mean, I think the first thing is discovering that you are not alone, and then moving from there. Okay, we got lots of hands now.
Oh, well, I'll be fast. Just going back to my allusion to NASA, one thing I was trying to get at was that, yes, we can go and launch ourselves into space and discover what it means to be human in this great universe of ours. But obviously NASA had its birth in the fear that we had of destruction, nuclear destruction, from a quote-unquote enemy. And then, of course, to launch ourselves into space means some great environmental damage in terms of how much energy it takes and burning fuel to get one astronaut or even one small satellite into space. But that's not to say it's not great. But I did want to say, as a Baptist, Episcopalian, electrical engineer, software engineer, aerospace engineer. No, but I did go to a couple of Quaker meeting houses when I was in. But you know, I always think of religion and faith as that which helps me understand how I relate to others and how I understand my being as important in some way. And then I think of science as a way for us as human beings to understand our environment and to verify what we understand to be our environment as true, to be able to have a method to validate or verify what we believe is actually true and not just some belief. And so I've never thought of those as somehow mutually exclusive.
Yeah, to me, where the big barrier in science is the insistence, which I know many scientists don't believe in their heart, but which they seem to need to profess publicly to be members of the clan, is that there is no agency. And a key distinction here is that whereas conventional science says there is no agency, the integral spirit says that agency is pervasive. And the extraordinary thing to me is that it's through the scientific knowledge of how life actually organizes that it becomes so obvious that agency has to be pervasive. I mean, there's just no other conceivable answer, explanation. So, you know, to me, science kind of got itself caught in a trap based on its own assumptions, that to really study the physical and do it honestly, we have to assume there is no agency so that we can understand the mechanical part. But now we need to marry it back and recognize what are the mechanical dimensions. It does operate by rules. What are the rules? But then where does agency come in, and how do we get a deeper understanding of agency, of consciousness, of different kinds of consciousness, different kinds of agency, and so forth, so that we deepen our understanding of the whole. But this is why I think, you know, the conversation between people who are doing the spiritual inquiry and the scientists, but a really open mutual learning could be extremely powerful.
Yeah, with regard to space exploration, I always thought it was interesting that we make such a great effort to try to find life somewhere else when we're destroying so much life on Earth. Many species that have not yet been identified are going to be destroyed before we can get to them.
Well, we're looking for another place to go once we've destroyed this planet. So I mean,
yeah, there's
a lot of money in that potentially.
If you were to travel from one one side of our galaxy to the other side at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, it would take you 100 million years to get there. So I don't think we're going to be doing that very soon. But actually, I did want to speak a little bit from the science side. I come from the field of anthropology. And with respect to your description of the survival of the fittest, that paradigm being supposedly being promoted by science, I think you'd be happy to know that most scientists do not accept that anymore. That was a phrase that was coined back in the mid-19th century by Herbert Spencer, a sociologist, who was really trying to justify laissez-faire capitalism, and it was eaten up by the entrepreneurs of the time as a justification.
Would you tell the economists that it's...
I wish I could. I think economists have this wrong, this perception wrong. In fact, evolutionary biologists and anthropologists describe, yes, evolution as a struggle. There's always a struggle. Cactus struggle against the environment by developing needles to retain its moisture. Broadleaf plants survive in the tropics because they need to lose moisture rather than retain it. Eskimos are stocky in build because the stockiness, the shape, helps them retain body heat. Maasai of East Africa are long and lanky because they need more surface area for losing body heat in that environment. And it's not that the stocky people in the Arctic were clubbing the tall, lanky people to death, and that's how they became stocky, or vice versa in East Africa. So yes, and species consume each other. If you think about it, all species are in the state of eating or being eaten. And even we, at the end, no matter how sealed and how nice that casket is, eventually we're going to be consumed by the microbes, and everything gets recycled. So, but with respect to this idea of agency, can we derive a morality from our own existence? This idea that human beings developed, or the human species developed, where people were in direct competition with each other, just doesn't meet with the facts, the anthropological facts and the historical facts. People lived in small hunting and gathering bands of about 40 people in areas of several hundred square miles. And they intermarried with their neighbors. So they were, and they shared. If you didn't have sufficient water in your territory, you could go to your neighbor's territory. Sometimes you had to ask permission, but it was granted. If one group happened to kill a large animal, too much for them to consume, they didn't have refrigerators, they would share it with neighboring groups. Sometimes the neighboring groups would be fortunate, so they would be sharing. And so human beings evolved in societies in which these basic human values that we cherish, cooperation and sharing, were there. And so we can derive these values. We're not alone, we have each other. We derive these values from our existence. And so that is an agency in which scientists and spiritualists can see common ground.
You know, it's interesting. The whole conversation about what's happening in science. Are you familiar with Stuart Kaufman? He was quite a figure at the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity Theory. I've actually gotten into a wonderful exchange with him, but he's very much into the physics line of science, and he has been writing and speaking to scientists for a very long time, struggling to get some acceptance that maybe there are some forms of agency involved in the what we think of as the physical world. Now, I think it's a very interesting conversation because, of course, a lot of my thinking comes out of people that I develop relationships with who define themselves as new biologists who try to understand life on its own terms rather than from a reductionist biology standpoint. And clearly, to me, the frontiers of that science are not denying agency. And all the things that you say, that beginning to understand that in the deeper picture, life is a foundationally cooperative activity. Even though by life's nature, there's certain forms of life that are able to get their nutrients directly out of the soil, and then there are other forms like us that can't do that, and so life eating life can be looked at as a brutal competition, but if you look at it in terms of the organization of the whole and the development of the whole, it is in effect a profoundly cooperative as long as we minimize the brutality and the gratuitous violence involved. But I think, as we're all familiar, the indigenous traditions of doing a ceremony or a blessing before you kill the animal to give your thanks for its sacrificing its life so that we can live. A very different kind of orientation. But fascinating. And this, I was fascinated by David Sloan Wilson's recent book and the whole story of how evolutionary biologists are coming to a very different understanding of how we evolve to cooperate, actually. But these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have out in the public and within this larger kind of framework. And with a questioning then of, okay, what does this mean about our economics? And one of the things I wanted to mention, you were talking about evolution, ecology as a frame. And of course, Daly and Cobb laying the foundation of ecological economics, which has become a major field in economics. But they made a mistake, I think, as they tried to move that forward. It was the basic idea that because the economy is embedded in the society, which is embedded in nature, and yet conventional economics essentially treats society and people and nature and life as externalities, that you need to start from the living system and then work back. Now, they engaged economists in that inquiry. Instead of starting with, we're going to start with the ecologists and then work backward from ecology. And I think we would have had a very different result because what we've come out with is, in ecological economics, bears very little relationship to the original concept. But again, all part of this larger conversation and the new, deeper inquiry. How are we doing on time? I understand that we're about 40 minutes. Good. Okay.
So I've this is so stimulating. I can't tell you. I mean, all the thoughts. I think of the library that could be built from the experiences each of us are having. I come at this from this gardening perspective, where I'm kind of into soil and microorganisms, and I look at this tale of 3 billion years of microbes creating oxygen and creating an environment and life evolving and getting just all sorts of influences contribute to this, and how
she is the penultimate biologist looking at that piece of life and how the one-celled organisms evolve. If you're not familiar with her work,
Lynn Margulis, great.
It is extraordinary. You read that and you realize the most fascinating part of evolution were those earliest stages with a single-celled life.
Well, and now we see microorganisms in the soil breaking down nutrients for plants, and then microorganisms in us breaking down the nutrients in the food for us, and them filling us and covering us, and this reality of the co-creation and the interbeing that is our life, and yet we cling to this kind of notion of individuality, and I can't help but coming back time and again. I studied with Thich Nhat Hanh, and the first night he explained to this crowd that some of us would understand better if we fell asleep. And I was deeply annoyed, because I was sitting there with my notebook ready to, dice and slice it into a framework. And he really wanted us to, be energetically connected to what was coming up from him. And that I can't help but think, I love David Brooks' Social Animal, and the way in which our experience is so wildly complex, and our rational veneer, can only factor a very small amount. Tonight, I'm profoundly stimulated by the veneer and what it's bringing forth. But I can't help but think there has to be some new integration or a continual evolution of our integrating these layers of consciousness. That while I am able to, function fine in this world and still hop on a jet to Europe and, throw things away that I shouldn't throw things away and on, I know that down in my gut and my heart, I'm profoundly aware of the devastation that I'm inflicting on the earth and the way in which my comfort is dependent on the oppression of my brothers and sisters. Even though rationally I'm able to just kind of process it, just like the people who go, yeah, I hear what you're saying and I agree, but I'm going to party. And so how do we de-emphasize or reintegrate these other layers of knowing? That's where I'm at in terms of trying to understand a way to get to this greater consciousness.
See, this is a key issue in terms of the way we need to redefine the problem and rethink. And it's fascinating. It comes back to the extraordinary influence of our sense of individualism in the West. That it comes back, and people like yourself, we're all encouraged. Well, if you got a problem with the wasteful air travel and so forth, then act on it. Don't fly. Or if you don't want to eat GMOs, don't eat GMOs. Well, if you look back at how society is organized, we've organized the whole system so that it's extremely difficult to live in any reasonable way without doing things that we know are damaging. Which is why it is not just an individual awakening or an individual responsibility. It involves changes we have to make as a species. Now, one of the key examples of this is cars. We all know that cars are an extraordinarily destructive technology, and we simply cannot continue expanding our use of cars. Now, when Fran and I lived for 5 years in New York City, right in the heart of Manhattan, we did not have a car. It's the only time in our lives we have not had a car. And we didn't have a car because of some purist sense that we shouldn't have a car. It's because the way Manhattan is organized, you got to be crazy to have a car. And there's no need to have a car. It's just an encumbrance. Now that's made me very conscious of the impact of how we organize, and it's either easy or it's very difficult to do the right thing. And so part of it is asking these questions. Okay, if we wanted to have a society without cars, how would we organize? And it would obviously be very, very different. You would not have sprawling suburbs. We probably would end up that some people who live in particular locations have to have a car because there's no other reasonable transportation. But I would guess that the 99% of us could live properly organized so that we don't have a car. Or at the most, a family would get along just fine with one car. But you play this out in almost every aspect of life, and we begin to realize, wow, it's a collective issue. It's got to be involve collective as well as individual choices. Now we got. I want to get a little further into some of the economic pieces, but have we given everybody a chance?
I just realizing the difficulty of speaking about a new paradigm when we use the old paradigms. When we reflect on the paradigm of religion and science, which we all know where they have led us, or those old stories. The story that religion is this crazy belief in someone else's spirituality. And we know what these monotheistic religions had led us to in terms of power, etc. Mm-hmm. And then the crazy belief in science that we could explain everything and measure everything. And of course we know what we did with that, which is to transform the earth into a commodity and quote unquote try our best to destroy it. So what is the other paradigm? I'm sitting here trying to find that in your introduction today. And what is staying with me the most is what you said affected you the most in your life. 5 minutes of rites of passage by an indigenous man. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm staying with that part of the conversation. Okay. And which is influencing me the most is what our need today, to go back to the paradigms in which human beings live connected like trees, the roots of trees down the earth. Mm-hmm. Human beings connected to our own connection to the earth and to each other. So I'm looking more into mythology and into these things that informed this elder that came to your party and told you at 65 you're not dead, you're just beginning. And it's time for you to give to everybody. Yeah. So I'm interested in those paradigms that are nothing old, nothing new. They're original in the sense that they are in the origins. Yeah. And those stories, not this only unique story we were given of Adam and Eve or whatever that was. Instead of the story that we all part of the ongoing creation of the world. Mm-hmm. And that the world doesn't end. These paradigms will end, definitely they should. But that the world is this ongoing movement, and the earth will shake itself, and we might all disappear, and it will continue. That life will continue. So I'm trying to look at those places where these cosmologies and these stories still are alive in the earth.
Yes. One of the things that's fascinating, you mentioned your passion to get your hands into the dirt. It's fascinating to me the number of young people these days who are going back to the land. One of our major African American leaders in Seattle has been organizing his community to do a major community farm. And he talks about in the initial stages there's an awful lot of resistance because African Americans, their freedom was to get away from from the farm, from the dirt. But they're beginning to get beyond that and recognize exactly this, this is rediscovering our humanity. This is rediscovering what it means to be alive. And I'm fascinated with the number of books that are coming out about, our animal nature, traditional wisdom, what we learn from traditional wisdom. I think there is an extraordinary awakening taking place, and that this is a moment of readiness. Just to go back to When Corporations Rule the World, which was a very successful book. Now, I've always been extremely aware, I think it's a pretty good book, but the success was because it came out at exactly the moment that people were asking the questions that the book addresses. And there was a readiness at that moment. And so, wow. And that's partly why I'm so conscious of this particular moment as, again, a moment like that, but for a much bigger conversation, a much bigger story. And I think it comes out of, this deep despair, in a sense, that clarity that what we have is not working. What we have is clearly not working. Now, I think it may be helpful in terms of your understanding of the implications of the paradigm to take this conversation to the next step. Now, where I think the foundation, as you suggest, I agree, clearly comes from indigenous wisdom, indigenous sense of connection to Earth, of Sacred Earth Mother. These are the foundational frames of the new paradigm. But what science contributes, among other things, is a much more sophisticated understanding of how the processes by which that integral spirit organizes and manifests, how those play out, so that we can understand it at a much deeper level. And, of course, the reality is, given the density of our populations, there's no way that we can go back to the traditional ways of living in an exact replication. But the hope is that by understanding how nature organizes, how creation organizes, we can fundamentally rethink our institutions and how we organize to live in a very different way. But it's going to require drawing on the knowledge and teachings of science. Now, since this is all, whoops, lost the, whoops, way back at the start. Okay. One of the things that is so amazing to me in terms of the miracle of life and its capacity for cooperative self-organization, if we talk about the ecosystem, of course it's very complex and very diffuse, and all this complicated interplay of cooperation and competition. But if we look at our body, starting with the fact that we are each comprised of tens of trillions of individual living cells, these are each individual decision-making living beings. And they're, of course, the cells that are an integral part of our physical body. And then I forget who mentioned all the microbes that live in us and on us and so forth. And, some of them are very bad. But most of them are absolutely essential to our healthful function. We could not exist without them. So those are trillions more cells. And somehow, all these cells have come together and they work in this extraordinary way to produce this larger multi-celled organism with capacities for physical grace, for mental acuity, for doing all kinds of things beyond any possible imagination of the individual cell. And it's also very fascinating to me that this all plays out without any evident central control. We kind of get confused. The central nervous system obviously has its functions and it coordinates a lot of our activities. But the basic maintenance of the body and the replacement of damaged tissues and all of the many processes of processing our food and our wastes and managing the flow of oxygen and blood and so forth, this is not all centrally controlled. This is the self-organization of these cells. And the only thing that makes any sense to me is that at some level, each cell has a sense of its individuality and the importance of its individual integrity, but at the same time recognizing that it's an integral part of a larger whole without which it cannot itself exist. And so at every stage, there is this balancing of the cell must maintain its own health and integrity to perform its function with the whole, but also recognizing that ultimately it has to coordinate and share energy. And one of the biologists that really introduced me to this and the phenomenal aspect of it is that at least by her reckoning, science has found that these cells, in a sense, somehow seem to be able to communicate with each other at faster than the speed of light, and to instantly move energy from any part of the body where it's available to where it's needed in case of a crisis or emergency. You know, breathtakingly extraordinary. Just breathtaking. So then we get the biosphere, the living earth, and of course trillions of organisms, multicelled organisms, of all the many different species and varieties, self-organizing. Now, they self-organize locally everywhere. And this is key. The system organizes from the bottom. But then, through a fractile structure of the interplay of these individual decision-making organisms, they create a self-managing system that maintains our soils, our rivers, our aquifers, fisheries, forests, grasslands, atmosphere, the climatic and chemical balance of the atmosphere. Wow. Wow. And it's all the individual organisms, most of which are rooted in place. I'm really eager to hear from a biologist sometime who can explain to me what is the distinctive function of migratory species and migratory birds, aside from following their food. But if we recognize that it seems every species, every being has its place in relation to the whole, recognizing there are also rogues. I mean, there are cancer cells, there are parasites and so forth that are fundamentally destructive and may not have any particularly useful function. But on the whole, every being has its place and contribution to the whole. We've got a long way to go in terms of deepening our understanding of how that works. But the key here is deepening our understanding of those organizing processes and then thinking about how the principles involved. And from what I see, these are key principles. Earth's biosphere, organizing principles. Organize as self-governing, self-reliant communities. Essentially, we have bioregional zones, the biological zones on the Earth of particular kinds of species, and they're bounded by particular kinds of climatic zones and rivers and mountains and oceans and so forth. But the very distinctive ecologies that organize within themselves, essentially, but then as they relate to others, they all contribute to the overall dynamic of the biosphere and the dynamics of the living planet, which then redounds back and has influence at the local level, but with a continuous process of adaptation, resilience, and also continuous evolution to ever higher levels of complexity and possibility. So the second rule is be local everywhere. Adapt to your place. Live within your means. Now here again, once you begin to understand it, these living organisms at each spot on Earth and going right down into the micro spaces in the soil are organizing to maximize the capture, sharing, and utilization of nutrients, water, and information, and energy. Nutrients, energy, water, and information. We are just barely at the frontiers of understanding how that works. Favor diversity, cooperate and share to optimize the resilience and creative potential of the whole. Be frugal, recycle and reuse, waste nothing. Exchange and share with your neighbors, but maintain and manage your borders. And this is a fundamental organizing principle that the cell cannot exist if the cell wall is violated, because the cell has to maintain that embodied active energy that allows it to function. And our bodies have a skin. This is the membrane by which our body manages its relationship with the environment and with other individuals. And if we didn't have that, we can't exist. But you see at each level of life, Earth has its atmosphere, which is the membrane by which it manages its relationship to intrusions from outer space. And that's why some of us apply this to thinking about these issues of trade and about national boundaries. But it's really important. The boundaries of life must be permeable, but they also must be managed. So if you remove the boundary entirely, then there's a dissipation of energy and the organism dies. But it also dies if you close off that wall from interaction with your environment, because you have to be continuously involved in this exchange of energy, nutrients, information, etc. So getting that balance right and learning to manage those boundaries in ways that sustain a balance with the whole is absolutely crucial. So we begin to think about these basic principles as a foundation for organizing our economy, which is really about organizing human society for how we relate to each other and relate to Earth. Now, if we look at the function of story and the way our stories shape our behavior and the consequences of where we're headed as a species, we got a lot of stories that are responsible for creating a sick society. Time is money. Money is wealth. Making money creates wealth. Consumption is the path to happiness. As I mentioned way up at front, isn't this interesting? Money's nothing but a number, most of it on a computer hard drive. That's wealth. But we get so entranced, and we actually literally worship money and the free market, which means a market without rules, as our sacred objects, as our reasons for being. Another sick story. Inequality is essential to prosperity because the rich are the job creators. You ever heard that? They deserve their reward. Envy is a mortal sin. So all you people talk about equality, that's just envy. Where are you going in that hand basket? I think I got these out of order. But aligned with that, the business of business is business. Maximizing financial return is the moral duty of both business and the individual. If we take care of ourselves, society will take care of itself. You hear that one going around. As nature evolves and prospers through a brutal competition for survival and dominance, human societies advance and prosper through competition for survival and dominance in the free market, which of course then ties in with the business competition. And then our relationship to Earth. God created Earth for human benefit and instructed us to go forth and multiply. I sometimes think, okay, God, we did that. Now what? Earth's resources have value only as we turn them into commodities and products valued in the marketplace. So you begin to get this frame. This is the frame underlying our whole economic system, and the system that ultimately leads us on this path of the self-destruction of life. So think about that in contrast to these alternative stories, the stories of a healthy society. And I particularly love this first one. Time is life. Last March, I was at a gathering, a little gathering with a number of indigenous environmental leaders. And one of the participants was from Bhutan, was the head of the Gross National Happiness Commission that does their happiness indicators. And he was giving us a little presentation. At the end, he just matter-of-factly said, "Time is life." I thought, wow, that sounds like a phrase I've heard. Time is money. Now, if you simply juxtapose those two phrases, you have got the difference between the two paradigms. Anyhow, I want to run through quickly because I think it's part of anchoring down your sense of what's really the larger meaning of the paradigm. Making time for life is the path to happiness. Money as an accounting system consists mainly of numbers encoded on computer hard drives. This equality is essential. The amazing epidemiological research, other research showing that equality is essential to community and thereby to human health and happiness. That our ultimate well-being depends on our membership and participation in community. Sharing and sufficiency are signs of maturity and acts of virtue. Extreme inequality is a symptom and cause of system failure. I mean, if you really take seriously this idea that we are born by nature to be individualistic, competitive, even violent, those are basically the qualities of a sociopath or psychopath. And we need to stop and think, what are we celebrating when we celebrate those characteristics? Because we know that these are the characteristics that are the characteristics of healthy, mature human beings. If you are not loving and caring, it would be good to get a little professional help. Earth is our sacred mother. As she loves and nurtures us, we must love and care for her. Life survives and prospers through cooperation and sharing as an interdependent Earth community, or Earth community of life. The only legitimate purpose of a business is to sustain and grow the living wealth of the community. In other words, to serve. Why would we have a business? Why would we have any institution unless its purpose was to serve society in some way? Destroying human and natural capital to maximize financial gain is both immoral and insane. The fact that we are literally destroying the real living capital of Earth and the living capital of community in order to grow the numbers on computer hard drives, could you think of a more insane act? Creation gave humans the gift of reflective consciousness to better know itself, enhance the creative potential of Earth community, and to advance creation's unfolding toward ever greater beauty and possibility. The true meaning of our lives. We are here for a purpose as part of this extraordinary creative process, this epic journey of becoming. Wow. Why would I want to retire? Very different economies, very different defining values. Defining value, one, money, the other is life. Competition to maximize self-interest versus cooperation to optimize self and community interest. Now, a key thing about the suicide economy, or the old economy, the decision-making power gets centralized in financial markets and global corporations and is exercised top-down. It doesn't start with the earth and community and move up. So in the new economy, the new paradigm economy, power decision-making is localized, broadly distributed to people and communities. It's bottom-up. Time frame, from immediate financial return to sustained living return. Local character, from homogenized monoculture of chain stores and strip malls to diverse and distinctive, many, many different businesses, institutions, architecture that fit with the local character and create a local character. From the monopolization of resources to the sharing of resources. From a resource flow that is global, linear, one-time use from mine to dump. I mean, if you carry the theories of trade, of conventional economics, not real economics, but the contemporary economics, somehow the economy works best when everything we consume is produced on the other side of the world, and then we pay for it with goods that we produce and ship to them. Now, the only folks that benefit from that are the global corporations that control that exchange in both directions. We have all this attention on the deficit, the financial deficit. The financial deficit, if you understand it, is only money that we owe to each other. So as a collective, it's only money that we owe to ourselves. But when we get social and environmental deficits, those are real. Those are real. Efficiency measure. Our primary concern in economics with efficiency is returns to financial capital, returns to money, grow the money. Whereas what we really need to be measuring is returns to social and natural capital and the development and continual building of true wealth of social and natural capital. The focus in the old economy in terms of growth is infinite growth of money and material consumption. In our living economy, growth is a stage in life's endless regenerative cycles of birth, growth, death, and rebirth, and unlimited growth is the philosophy of the cancer cell. It's a pathology. Now, just quickly, when I think about the larger change strategy, there are three basic elements. And we focused on the story element, which is the foundation. It's the starting point. We can't change until we begin to have a new story, a vision of the possible future. So that is the start. And we need to, this is where we need this paradigmatic shift. And I wish we had a little more time to talk about the distinctive role of interfaith and interspirit groups and organized religion, but this is a conversation, obviously, that I hope you will continue after tonight. Now, the second the strategic intervention is to create the new reality from the bottom up. And, of course, this is going on all around us. The youth that are returning to the land, the communities that are beginning to rebuild their local food systems and food sheds, the move toward organic agriculture and away from industrial agriculture. We go on and on. The move your money from Wall Street banks to local banks. It's happening all around, not necessarily the coherence that we ultimately need, but that is part of creating the new, and it's creating it from the bottom up. It's not starting from changing it from the top down, which basically you can't do. There's a very powerful theory out of forest biology that ecosystems evolve not by, again, not from the top down, not from changing from within the existing structures, but from creating the new structures from the bottom up. I mean, that's what we're doing with the new economy. The idea is we create the institutions, the values, the relationships of the new economy from the bottom up. And as you have more options as an individual as to where you work, shop, and invest, you can begin to pull your energy, your life energy. Now, it's also pulling your money, but it's really shifting your life energy, your support from the corporate system and global financial markets and so forth to your local economy. And the further we go building that new structure, the more alternatives we have in terms of redirecting our life energy. So it becomes a self-reinforcing process. And third is to change the rules to support the power shift from the old to the new. And so here are some of the areas where you want to intervene with the rules and the system structures to shift power. Indicators instead of GDP, which is essentially a measure of how fast is money circulating through the economy, to things like the Bhutan happiness indicators, which are about real indicators of real living people and living systems, not reduced to a financial metric. But, you know, what are the indicators of the health of our children? Are we getting educated? Are people getting enough to eat? What are the indications of the strength of our social fabric, the participation in community activities? What would be indicators of the health of our political institutions if they were truly democratic? It involves a fundamental restructuring of the money system. If you're interested in this particular issue, I've got a report of the New Economy Working Group on liberating America from Wall Street rule. Essentially, it tracks out how those of my generation, when we were growing up, most of our financial institutions in the United States were local banks, credit unions, mutual savings and loans, and so forth. So these were instruments by which we managed our savings and recycled them in the community to support local businesses and home ownership and so forth. This is, you know, a high-functioning, proper, healthy money system. But then we took away the rules that allowed for consolidation, so this control moved up into Wall Street institutions that have no connection to the local, have actually no interest in productive investment. They're only interested in financial gains and speculation and anything that they can do to make money, preferably without producing anything of any value in return. Totally perverse. And that's where the money is actually, it's just a number, but the system of money is the system of power. It's the system by which we manage and allocate power in society. And that's how it needs to be understood. So if we want that power in the community, we need our financial institution rooted in community. We need, ownership is key. Instead of ownership through the most extreme form of absentee ownership in global financial markets, ownership should be local. And we're seeing a new move toward cooperative ownership, particularly cooperative worker ownership, which is rooted in community. And it is within a framework of recognizing that it's not just about maximizing profit or financial return, but it's about having a healthy enterprise that I like to work in, I enjoy going to work, and that is serving the community. Instead of organizing around governance by global financial markets, organize around bioregional communities. And then this third one, just very quickly. If you look at our current legal system, the paramount rights are rights of corporations. And if you look at Supreme Court decisions, it's kind of like that's what they were put there to make sure that we recognize that corporate rights supersede all other rights. In the new paradigm, we're talking about the rights of nature, the rights of life, sacred earth. Now you see this here. In the old economy, it starts with primary rights of corporations, then property rights. They take precedent over human rights. The human rights take precedence over nature, so nature is last. Corporations are first. What we need is exactly reverse that. But the most important rights are the rights of nature, but particularly the rights of living systems. And if you think about it, to secure our future, we must absolutely maintain the integrity of the systems by which the natural systems that manage our soils and air and water and so forth. And any compromise of that is a crime against humanity, and particularly against future generations. But it's also a crime against Earth itself. So then we have to recognize that human rights are derivative of, but subordinate to, the rights of nature. Property rights are one form of human right, but subordinate to our larger range of human rights. And corporations are at the very bottom. If they have any rights at all, it comes only after all these other rights are recognized. So you begin to see more how this paradigm plays out in terms of application. And we're not going to have time for that, but how it plays out within this sequence of the big story, starting with the integral spirit cosmology, then connecting in as the frame for living Earth, and then that being the frame for our living economies, thinking about the fundamental restructuring of our cultures and institutions. So obviously we could go on a bit longer, but this is the time for closing. And my hope and my plea to you is that recognizing your own reactions here, the energy of this conversation, that we need to expand this conversation. And we need to take it out of, we need to do it in retreat centers, but we also need to get it out into the public forum. And that's part of it. And we're getting at the language right. What's the language that works and attracts people? Because this is the moment. And if we can change the framing story so that we are thinking about sacred earth as the kind of framing concept around which we reorganize society, everything else will begin to shift. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I do hope that we will continue this conversation. Thank you, dear David. That was hard work and fascinating. I want us also to think about the things we didn't agree with. I mean, we've got to have that opportunity to say, wait a minute, what about Jesus? Where does all this fit? So we need to ask those questions and not be embarrassed to do that. And then we got to figure out, you know, we've started this economic justice working group, and we've got all this going on about economics. How does this all, we've got to have a very practical application of this. Because, yeah, we do have to buy the groceries, and we do have to make things work while we're making the transition. That's where Fran comes in, because she's the practical one with Yes Magazine. You better all subscribe to that. So there's lots of copies. So we just want to keep this conversation going on. Dr. Korten, I want to thank you for stimulating us. This is a long series. I was thinking, gee, I'm going to flunk this class. But we really need to be engaged and not be afraid of long conversations with difficult questions. Thank you, everybody. I'm so proud of you all for showing up and raising your hands and thinking about this very timely, perfect time subject for this church, this community, and the rest of us, sacred earth. And you are sacred people. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.